Hello, my name's Dr. Mwenza Blel, and I'm one of the organizers of Cafe Culture Northeast. I have the pleasure of welcoming you all to this evening's Cafe Scientifique event entitled The Disordered Cosmos. And it's a conversation between leading theoretical physicist Dr. Chanda Prescod-Weinstein and philosopher Dr. Adam Ferner. Cafe Culture Northeast is a collaboration between the Institute for Public Policy Research Northumbria University, the Policy, Ethics, and Life Sciences Research Center at Newcastle University, where I'm based, the Philosopher Journal, and Newcastle Philosophy Society. For the past 15 years, we've run a series of free events for thinkers that aim to generate discussion, debate, and a convivial atmosphere. Normally, it's held in central Newcastle upon Tyne in the UK, and we seek to provide a space for people to think, share ideas, and to have a lively, inclusive discussion. But we've had to move these online now, so we hope to have some of the same atmosphere despite being on Zoom. I'll just introduce our two speakers. Chanda Prescod-Weinstein is an assistant professor of physics and astronomy and core faculty in women's and gender studies at the University of New Hampshire. She's also a columnist for New Scientist and Physics World. Her research in theoretical physics focuses on cosmology, neutron stars, and particles beyond the standard model. She also conducts research in Black feminist science, technology, and society studies. Adam Ferner has worked in academic philosophy both in France and the UK, but much prefers working outside academia in youth centers and other alternative learning spaces. He's published widely in philosophical and popular journals and is currently writing his fifth book, Philosophical Empires, with Chris Maines, forthcoming later this year. He's an associate editor of the Forum's essays and a member of Changelings, a North London fiction collaboration. The two are here to discuss Chanda's bold and inspiring new book, The Disordered Cosmos, a journey into dark matter, space-time, and dreams deferred. We'll give the two of them a chance to discuss, and their conversation will end in about 35 or 40 minutes when we'll open up for discussion and questions from you, our audience. Thank you.
Thank you, Mwenza. And thank you, Chanda, so much for talking to me again, because we did an interview which appeared in, I think it's forthcoming in the next issue of The Philosopher. And I thought, if it's okay with you, that I might start by saying a few words about your work, just so that everybody's on the same page. And then you can tell me how I've massively misrepresented you.
That sounds great. I'm looking forward to taking you down.
Good, me too. Okay, so I think one of the things that I wanted to start with is this concept of white empiricism, which is a concept that you develop in a rather brilliant 2020 paper. I mean, rather in the British sense, so very brilliant 2020 paper, Making Black Women Scientists Under White Empiricism. And in your also brilliant recent book, which I strongly recommend people reading, which is out now in all good bookstores, or it should be, The Disordered Cosmos. So empiricism, generally speaking, is a way of finding stuff out about the world. It's an epistemic practice, and it's geared towards and around observation. And as I understand it, white empiricism is a form of empiricism and currently the dominant epistemic practice in Western science. And it has some deeply troubling features. For one thing, despite all of the well-known claims by scientists, especially physicists, that these disciplines are cultures of no culture, white empiricism positions certain people, especially white men, as competent observers or knowers, or epistemic superiors, and others, invariably including people of colour, as less competent and in fact unreliable. And this is a form of what Christy Dotson calls epistemic oppression. And so by an understanding of epistemic oppression, certain people are structurally discredited as knowers, that is, as people who can know stuff. But in addition to this idea of epistemic oppression, white empiricism claims that scientific practice excludes the testimonies and contributions of people of colour. No, sorry, I've got that wrong. In addition to excluding the testimonies and contributions of people of colour, which is the epistemic oppression, the Dotson line, white empiricism also involves a resistance to and a willingness to ignore certain types of empirical data. So not only is the practice exclusionary, but it fails on its own terms to objectively investigate phenomena. An all-white, all-male scientific research group is both politically and scientifically compromised under conditions of white empiricism. So I guess this leads to the kind of like first question, and this is where you can say how I've misrepresented that in a very brutal summary. And it's all also obviously quite a bit abstract at this point, but I wonder if you could flesh out these two aspects of white empiricism in relation to a term which you focus on in the book, and which I know you focus on in your research, which is dark matter. So how does the term dark matter discredit specific people as knowers and affect the analysis of empirical data? And sidebar, what exactly is dark matter? Oh wait, no, that's a big question. Just give us a rough, yeah.
Okay, well, why don't I start by giving a little bit of the background about the science of dark matter so that everybody has kind of a shared vocabulary for whatever we might say next, which is that when you look at the sky or when you're looking around, just like look at yourself, look at your house, you think that most of what is inside the universe is the stuff that you can see. And observations of galaxies, specifically initially observations of how fast stars are orbiting the centers of galaxies, indicated to us that actually there is a bunch of matter that we can't see, that now has the name dark matter and the reason it has that name I think is salient here. So I'll get into that in a second. And that actually that's most of the matter in the universe. So 80% of the matter in the universe is dark matter. And so actually, like, if you've ever felt like a freak, you are. Because everything that we can see is what's unusual in the universe, right? We're what's abnormal, and for people who are going to maybe like go Google this later, you might say, oh, but actually I heard that like dark matter is only 25% of the universe, and so actually that's just if we're talking about matter. If we're talking about all of the matter energy content in the universe, then most of it is something called dark energy, which we could also talk about the name of. But let's focus on dark matter. But actually, relatively speaking, we are a small fraction of the energy matter content in the universe. That's the takeaway. And that dark matter is actually most of the matter. And so as a researcher in theoretical physics and in particle astrophysics, I focus primarily on trying to understand the dark matter question, which is, what is the dark matter? So I've just told you that there is like a lot of it, but I can't tell you how massive it is. So like with the electron, right? I can tell you, well, first of all, it has a name. I can tell you how massive it is, what its charge is, how it interacts with other types of particles. We don't know any of that information about the dark matter particle. And so I'm interested in this both as a particle physicist, but also as someone who thinks about astrophysics. There's still a lot that we don't understand about how dark matter, for example, clusters on very large scales. We know every single galaxy lives inside of what we call a dark matter halo. We're fairly confident about that. But exactly how the dark matter is distributed throughout space in these halos is something that we're still unsure about. Better understanding that might help us understand the micro properties of the particle. That's really where my research focuses. Okay, so that's the dark matter problem from, I'll put this in air quotes, a purely technical standpoint, right? So, the question of like, where does the name dark matter come from? So it has an interesting history. So the standard story is that it was coined in German as, I think, dunkle Materie. I'm a terrible German speaker, so. It was coined in German by Fritz Zwicky, a Swiss astronomer in the early 1930s. And he was looking at data about how stars were moving in galaxies and was thinking that maybe he was seeing these first hints that like the numbers didn't add up correctly. Maybe there was more matter, more mass there than what we could see radiating, right? And so this is the key point, is that it's not radiating. But actually before that, even going back all the way to the 1880s to England, Lord Kelvin was first talking about this idea that maybe there were dark bodies in the heavens. And I think this is a very interesting connection to make, that first of all, like Lord Kelvin, member of the House of Lords, the time period for this, the 1880s, is literally, they're talking about Africa as the dark continent, and they're really in the depths of like, we're going to South Asia, and colonialism in Africa in various forms and in genocidal forms is unfolding in a different way from the transatlantic slave trade, which at that point was over. But the word dark has a very particular meaning in that milieu, right? And so it continues to be the case that over the next few decades, occasionally people would talk about like, what if there are dark things up in the sky? And what they mean by dark varies. The thing I didn't say about dark matter when I was giving the technical description is that it's really invisible. So it doesn't have a color. Light goes right through it, right? So I think, Adam, the question that you're asking, and I find this question really interesting because it's actually not how I thought about it when I was writing the book or writing the paper. But certainly I see you drawing the connection here, is that when we're talking about dark matter, that word dark evokes different things for different people. So for people who are a part of for example, a racial, cultural, ethnic community where skin color is not such a focal point of identity and experience, people might just think like, well, yeah, like dark, like I'm wearing a black shirt, my shirt is dark, right? For someone like me, as a light-skinned Black woman who's coming from the Black community, where color determines your life opportunities in so many ways, how badly the racism you experience will be, like how bad the racism will be, that dark takes on a very different meaning when it's actually something that's potentially written on your body. And the way that it is read by the outer society when it's written on your body can be very bad, even if it is actually, as I write about in the chapter on the physics of melanin, a very beautiful thing. That's often not how being dark-skinned has been treated. So, just coming back to like this question of like, where's the connection with white empiricism? I think like one question there is when we talk to the general public about dark matter, and we don't clarify that dark matter is actually invisible, that it's actually transparent. What work is that word dark doing when we tell people there's something called dark matter out there? And then when people are like, oh yeah, dark matter, it's foreboding, which is definitely working on people's perceptions of darkness, dark people as scary, that even like, there were racial slurs in in North America that were predicated on the idea that darkness was scary, right? So I think I guess that's the connection I see you drawing. And I think that was part of the case that I wanted to make in the chapter Dark Matter Isn't Dark. And also in the chapter Black People Are Luminous Matter, was to actually say Black people are not dark matter, we are regular matter, just like white people.
So that, I mean, just to make sure that I've kind of understood it. So not only does dark matter create a diagnostic obstacle because it doesn't accurately characterize the phenomenon, but it also presents an obstacle to inclusion within the scientific community because it affects some people, and it also speaks to the history of white settler colonialism and so on. So those are the two sides of white empiricism. Is that, yeah?
Yeah, I mean, I actually think like maybe there's some value in sharing a little bit of the background of why I even started thinking about white empiricism and decided to articulate it with like a term, which I don't think I talk about this in the book. So this is like a little bit of like insider info. I was reading feminist philosophy of physics or of science that has these critiques of how science is practiced and the way that ignoring identity in science can actually lead to people not asking scientific questions that need to be asked. Like a really classic example of this is, how does this medication affect people that tend to have such and such hormone level, or tend to have such and such chromosome combination, right? And that when, for example, only white men are doing medical science or biological science, that the medicine tends to serve white men better than it tends to serve other groups. That, I think, is something that's intuitive for all of us, because all of us have had to deal with, like, you know, getting medical treatment and, you know, either finding that accessible or not accessible, et cetera. What I was seeing throughout the literature that talked about this was that people kept saying that physics was an epistemic exception. And so what they meant by this was that knowledge in physics, unlike other areas of science, actually was not impacted by the identity of the scientist or the knower in the same way that, like, I think my other favorite example is that for a long time we didn't understand sperm and eggs because people kept masculinizing the sperm and being like, and then it hunts down the egg, and it turned out that's like not at all exactly how it happens.
No, it's
right?
a tiny little man. I'm pretty sure that's right.
Yeah, right. Like it was like a little man like swimming to the egg, right? So and that all just had to do with projection, right? Like we could talk a lot about like how much Western masculinity is predicated on projection. But people would say, but physics is immune to this because the laws of physics are universal. Like gravity doesn't change because you have a penis. It doesn't change because you're a cis man, right? Like all of these things. And I was reading it and I was like, right, but I was reading this book in the first place because I really identified with the critique that was being made. Like I really, like, I was seeing this in the physics community. And so I wanted to articulate that in the physics community, yes, identity shapes epistemic outcomes. It shapes what we know about science. And that's not because, you know, Black physics is different physics. Like this isn't some throwback to like Aryan science, right? Or Aryan, it was particularly Aryan physics, which was like the Nazis were like, let's throw out all the German physics and somehow physics will still work. And it was like, well, it turns out a lot of your scientists were Jews, so that doesn't work at all, right? But I really wanted to say, like, identity is shaped. And is shaping what we know about science. And that's true even in a field where we're certain that the laws are universal. And that was kind of the backstory. And so in some sense, I'm a little bit picking a fight with feminist philosophy of science. And I felt like I was well positioned to do that because as a physicist, it was harder to say, well, she just doesn't understand the physics. Although of course that doesn't stop the white men who send me emails telling me I don't understand what I'm talking about.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I think, I mean, this is one thing that stands out about the book. As somebody who has a kind of background in philosophy of biology and has been to all of these conferences where they're intended to be interdisciplinary, it's so rare to see somebody move fluidly between different fields, and it's something that you do really, really well. This is, you know, I've already recommended buying it, so I don't know why people aren't buying it now. But anyway, I suppose a kind of follow-up question to that is, so obviously the scientific establishment is exclusionary, and yet at the same time, people of colour have been involved in, you know, women have been, marginalized groups have been involved in scientific enterprises from the word go. And this is something that you do talk about in the book. And I'd like to kind of like bring out your thoughts about collaboration, because it seems like white empiricism does devalue particular forms of labor, right, while celebrating others. And one thing that you do really well in the book is to highlight the different roles that are necessary for scientific projects to actually work. And so I'm thinking of the chapter Wages for Scientific Housework, in which you discuss the labor performed by the poor and working class people, usually of Black, Latinx, Indigenous and Asian heritage, who get paid below a living wage to keep the floors at universities and labs clean. So you point out that without such contributions, scientific work would not be possible. And I think that's true across all of the academic disciplines. But I suppose I kind of wanted to ask you a little bit more about that, because I take it that the differences between contributions are also important, right? So different labours require different skill sets and technical expertise, and some might come with specific responsibilities. So it would be inappropriate, for instance, to hold all employees of Purdue Pharma responsible for the aggressive marketing of dangerously addictive opioids. So can we acknowledge these differences without slipping into problematic hierarchies? Yeah, so can science be a truly egalitarian collaboration? I suppose is my question.
Yes, I think there are a few thoughts there, and just to kind of maybe top off the conversation about white empiricism. But part of what I'm saying is that I believe in empiricism as a practice, right? I believe in collecting data about the world and articulating, what quasi-Wiridu, the philosopher, articulated as rational knowledge production. I believe in doing that work. And part of what I'm doing is I'm looking at scientists and being like, so I was propagandized about this as a kid. You guys told me we collect data. We use the data to develop knowledge about the world. And I see you throwing out data, in particular, like a Black woman who has a 35-year-old Black woman who has like basically multiple PhDs in what does racism look like. And people are like, are you sure that was racism? Maybe you just didn't understand, right? That's really a resistance to data that forms, it's a type of anti-intellectualism. And so actually, the reason I called it white empiricism is I wanted to say, you are not practicing real empiricism, you are practicing white empiricism. And implicit in that is I'm saying you're practicing white supremacist empiricism. I just want to be clear that I use it as a shorthand, but for me, white supremacy is upheld by ableism, transphobia, patriarchy, hetero-cis sexism, like all of those things are coming together under that moniker. And then all of these things are a factor in how labor is valued. And so in some sense, the conversation, the question that you're asking here is really about how is labor valued? And I think the way that I think about these questions of like what matters is the work necessary? And so in Wages for Scientific Housework, I'm pointing out that I'll just pick like a really simple thing, that my spouse made me breakfast this morning while I was responding to emails, managing administrative stuff for my research group, right? Was it necessary? Yes, I actually don't do well if I don't eat breakfast, right? So what was more important, my emails or the breakfast or the production of the breakfast? The farm workers who, we get most of our food from local farms here in New Hampshire. All of that labor was essential for me to be sitting here having this conversation with you. And so, yes, maybe I bring some specialty knowledge to the table. I'm the one in the household who has a PhD in physics. I'm assuming that the farm workers may not have PhDs in physics, although I know my dad has an undergrad degree in maths and philosophy and then became a busboy, literally collecting money on the buses in Brighton after he finished at Sussex, right? So you never know, right? But the point is that regardless of who's a specialist, who's not, I don't know crap about working on a farm, first of all. I don't know anything about food. There are some people who are convinced I don't know how to fry an egg either. That's not true, but it is the case that probably I'm not as good at it as my spouse because he does it more. All of it is necessary. So the production of this conversation that you and I are having right now is not just one between you and me, right? It's also Anthony and Wenza and everybody else, Jocelyn and Victoria, the publicist that I've been working with. So that's the way that I think about it. Is the labor necessary? And if it is necessary, then how do we ensure that when people are tasked with doing it, that first of all, on some level, they are choosing the labor, right? And that the conditions in which they are doing that labor are ones that are dignified, that they have dignity in that labor. And that means, like, does it provide a living wage and all of these other things? So that's how I think about that.
No, that's super helpful, and unfortunately, I have loads of questions that come on from this. But also, I'm very conscious of time, and I want to make sure that there's enough for.
Okay, I'll try and shorten my answers.
No. I mean, yeah. If you could be less interesting, that'd be great. So, I mean, I just really want to know who doesn't think that you can fry an egg. Is one thing. But also, I guess, I mean, just to kind of to add to what you've said, I suppose that it's consonant with your view, certainly as it appears in the book, in the paper that I mentioned, that people who kind of work outside the academic institution have epistemic insights that people within it don't have, and that these can contribute very importantly to scientific projects. I guess that's what you would also like. So.
Yeah, I mean, on some level, like, I don't really care if, like, the people who delivered our farm share, like, last Thursday, like, whether they have special insight into physics, but also, they made sure that we're being fed. They've done an incredible job during the pandemic of making sure, like, entire communities have been fed, including facilitating donations from people like us who can afford to make them to people who are on welfare, to make sure that they can also have fresh food, right? They're supporting our entire community, and that enriches my life. And the ways in which my life is enriched make it more possible for me to do my work in the best possible conditions. So I think that's one aspect, but I will make the other comment that often people who are not experts in dark matter ask me the questions that get me thinking the most about how to rethink my ideas. And I think that this is an important piece just about how science is done, that the public is often given the impression that science is about what we know, that it's like, okay, here's a book, it has a chapter, I'm just showing everybody my book, it has, a chapter, I heart quarks in it, and then people walk away reading the first chapter and they're like, I have to have it memorized, I have to know, like, what all the quarks are, what, the leptons and all of that. Science is about what we don't know. And the thing I work hardest with my students is teaching them how to ask questions, and then how to ask better questions that take them in interesting directions. And so to the extent that I'm surrounded by people who are curious and asking me questions, that helps me stay curious, it helps me think about what are the questions that I need to be trying to answer.
Awesome. So just to kind of go back to you being committed to empirical practice, I suppose one thought, and this comes out of certain strands of metaphysics, is that, so the term empiricism is quite interesting, and scientists from the outside seem like they're often configuring what they do as engaging in observation and analysis of phenomena. But of course, they're not merely passive observers, right? And there is this thought, which is kind of born out of the work by people like Foucault or N. Catherine Hales or Donna Haraway, which is that in observing reality, scientists are also constructing it. Right, and so this is a point that Foucault makes in The Birth of the Clinic, where he documents how 18th century imaging technologies and surgical techniques opened up new conceptual spaces for medical science to inhabit. So clinicians came to think about bodies not as organic wholes that could be holistically treated, but as collections of organs that can be conceptually and then, importantly, literally dissected. So this was a space that wasn't previously there, but is now there, and it's in fact the world that we're living in. So we could talk about Cartesian views of the body as a machine, or and William Harvey's conception of the circulatory system as a series of pneumatic pumps. They're not just ways of seeing the body, I suppose, is the argument, but they're also ways of constructing it as well, and opening up the possibility of organ transplantation, to give one example. And I suppose I'm firstly interested to know whether or not you think that that has any mileage as an idea. But secondly, I guess if you do, then I suppose it prompts a worry, which is that if science has been dominated by white empiricism and scientific projects both observe and shape reality, then to what extent might reality conform to the expectations of white empiricism? And I suppose we could put it another way, which is, has institutional academic science gone too far down this route for its methods to be anything other than irredeemable? That's my pessimistic question.
You know, I have to say I'm a realist. So I really believe that that the universe exists out there outside of me. And that might be, what just makes it easier for me to sleep at night in some sense. It's a very empiricist or empirical, I guess empiricist friendly way of looking at the world. Which I don't know, so I do think that, there's a middle ground there, which is like you can be a realist and also believe that white supremacy structures our ability to engage with reality, and structures our ability to perceive and experience reality in shared ways, for example, right? Which is that now living on the New Hampshire seacoast, so for folks in the UK who have like no sense of geography, in the US, I'm not only north of New York, I'm north of Boston, but I'm like, not very far away from the Atlantic Ocean. So I'm about as close as you can get to England in the United States as possible. That's one way of putting it, right? Here, I have an incredible view of the night sky, like just an incredible view of the night sky. Is it actually like objectively incredible? I don't know, but it's incredible to me as someone who grew up in Los Angeles, in smoggy Los Angeles in the 80s and 90s, next to a freeway. And I see, the smog in Los Angeles and the light pollution in Los Angeles, and the fact that the freeway ran right through East LA in the way that it did between City Terrace and El Sereno. I grew up on the El Sereno side. That's a production of white supremacy. And it's literally shaping what is the sky that I grew up with, right? Which is like in LA at the time, you could see the moon and maybe you could see Venus and sometimes Mars, right? And so literally people who were growing up in New Hampshire at the same time were witnessing a different version of reality. And not just because we see the night sky differently depending on where you are on the globe, but because literally the quality of the air was structured differently. And so I do think that that's one way in which and I know that this is like not quite answering the question, but I think that that's my answer when people say, how does white supremacy structure our reality? I say, like, literally, we have kids who are growing up not being able to see the universe, and other kids who are growing up seeing a lot of the universe, right?
So I'm conscious of the time. And also I've got a question about Star Trek, which I wanted to ask you before. But it was denied to us because of time constraints. So
Ahura and I are ready.
Yeah. Okay, so you're a fan of Star Trek, as am I, and I wondered if we could talk a little bit about the role of science fiction and the scientific imagination in scientific practice. So from the outside again, science fiction seems to be an important method for mapping out conceptual terrain that scientists can go on to explore and inhabit. Whether it's stories about space travel told long before aeronautic expeditions, or Frankenstein-like fantasies about fungible, I don't know why I said I wrote fungible. I mean like replacement body parts which predate organ transplantation.
I don't know. I think fungible might be an interesting word to think through here with like teleportation as fungibility, right?
Oh, don't. Yeah, Anyway, so these stories often smuggle in specific biases, and this is the problem that I have with them. And it's very clear in the literature and analytic philosophy around thought experiments that, like the brain transplantation myth, that, you know, norms, gender norms, or prejudices about, you know, the experience of embodiment can be kind of imported wholesale often into this conceptual terrain. So I guess just on a general level, what role do you see scientific imagination playing in your own research? And how do you militate against reinscribing problematic norms, I guess? Practical.
Yeah, I mean, I guess like if I was just, you know, just to come back to like Star Trek and in some sense the problem of Star Trek, right? Which is that I love Star Trek. I can also like spend an hour telling you about what's wrong with it, right? I'm particularly like for people who watch Deep Space Nine, which I think is at least I'm open to discussion about Discovery, right? But Deep Space Nine is the best of the completed Star Trek series. Let's put it that way. It's the best of the completed Star Trek series. There's an authoritarianism that runs through the Federation that until we get to Discovery and Picard has remained unpacked. That's hinted at in Deep Space Nine, right? That like we're somehow living in our ideal socialist future, but is it actually socialist or is it authoritarian? And in some sense, you know, I think that sometimes people put too much on Star Trek because they want Star Trek to embody like they've solved the problem. And in some sense, what Star Trek can do is say, we would like to present you with a future where we imagine that the problem is solved, even if we can't actually put the solutions in your hands. And so what we see actually is a reflection of both our aspirations and our current failures at the same time, which is that like we aspire to this world, this egalitarian world where money is eliminated, where you know, men walk around in skirts. But then we also see the limits coming back to Deep Space Nine. You know, the first Black lead of a Star Trek show doesn't get to be a captain until like season 3, right? And so we have that problem, but also coming back to men in skirts, there's a character in the show, Garrick, who essentially the producers have since said, yes, he should be read as a gay man. And we wish that we had had that fight with Paramount to let him be a gay man in the show. And so you're seeing, here's queerness, but we can't actually do queerness. Yeah. And there are other ways that we see that in Star Trek. And so like, I think that, you know, it's funny, I'm not actually a big sci-fi head, but I find that Star Trek is a great place to think because it points us in better directions and also says, yeah, we don't know how to get there either. But yeah, like we should be thinking about how to get there. And we should also be picking apart the parts of Star Trek that are not how we get there. Yeah. Right?
Yeah, no, I think that's so interesting. And just before we slide into Q&A, I feel one of the things in Discovery, which is this has become a very focused conversation between you and me now, and hopefully some people in the audience also like Star Trek. But
I'm taking all Star Trek questions.
Right. Okay. All and only Star Trek questions. Excellent. So yeah, just thinking about the way that it's used to problematize and also like aspire is it's a very interesting take, because I guess one of the things, but Adira Tal is a character in the Discovery series who uses they them pronouns, but the only way that Star Trek has been able to write that into the script is by actually having Adira as possessing multiple selves. So it's not that it's kind of trans or it's non-binary in a way that we understand in contemporary society, but it's a way of kind of
yeah. So can I comment on that? Because I'll just like the one thing I really want to say about like Adira is that speaking of our limitations, you would think like I can't even actually remember what century, like my spouse is probably going to text me and be like, it was this century that they leaped to. It's like the 29th century or something like that, right? in the 29th century, I don't expect that anyone's going to have to be like, actually, my pronouns are they, them. Is everybody cool about that?
Yeah.
Because in the 29th century, people are going to be reading books about a time when there were different pronouns for different people, but there were only like 3 categories or 2 categories. And people are going to be like, what? Like,
yeah.
And I actually think that the writers made a mistake with that one piece of Adira's storyline that really bugged me, that I was like, why was Adira not introduced as they, them?
Right.
Yeah. Or why was the moment not, why this season didn't they have Earth be the site of, here I'm getting the text message, 32nd century, thank you. Why wasn't Earth the site where they're like, oh yeah, Earth has had this practice for a long time, and the Federation kind of fell out of practice with it for a while, but now we're back on it. That like when we introduce ourselves to each other, we say, these are the pronouns we like people to use when someone's not using our name.
Right.
That was like such an it was like such a like low-hanging fruit. Okay, yeah. I know we probably have to get to the Q&A, but I gotta say, like, the writers have been so brilliant, and I love Sonequa Martin Green. I didn't pick up the picture of me and her to show off because I like my Uhura Barbie, but she's right there. But it was low-hanging fruit that they missed, and I hope we haven't ruined anything for people who haven't seen season 3 of Disco yet.
Yes. Well, anyway, apologies if we have. I'm gonna try and get into the Q&A, and let's start. Let's start with a question from Joanne Harrod. The thought of people living in different environments and then having different experience or knowledge of space is important, but I'm wondering how the modern accessibility of media is influencing this. Is it narrowing the gap?
I think this is a really good question. And, at the end of the day, there's really like, I grew up under a night sky where I couldn't really see anything, as I said, right? And then there was the first time I saw the Milky Way from Chile, which I write about in the book. And it was this magical, completely life-altering moment for me. And I don't think that there really is a substitute for that particular experience. I think that that's a separate question in some sense from, can I respect the autonomy of Amazonian indigenous folks in South America if I don't get to go to the Amazon myself? And so I do think that at some point I have to make the decision that actually I don't need to be in the Amazon. There are other people for whom that is their home, and me going there is actually a threat to the land. And that has to be part of the conversation we have with ourselves, which is, what are the things that we truly need to experience ourselves, and what are the things that actually we should be experiencing through the media? So my spouse and I have been watching some TV show on Apple TV that's like the stories of like very tiny animals, narrated by Paul Rudd, who like is Ant-Man, right? And that's been like a really great journey for me to different parts of the world, that like I'm perfect, like I don't even like bugs, so I'm good indoors. Like, but that's been a great way for me to experience the world in a way that means that I'm not being physically disruptive to those environments. And so when I think about that question, that's what comes up for me.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And yeah, Joanne, thanks for the question. And if you have any follow-ups, just throw them in the chat. I've got one from Viraf Mehta, and I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name, who says very kindly, thank you both for this very interesting conversation, which is a win. I very much liked your point about curiosity. Do you think that the broader place of the others, i.e. outside those in the white supremacist empiricist group in society, is in a feedback loop that quashes their curiosity from an early age? And as a fellow axion theorist of color, what can we do to combat this? And you're going to have to explain to me exactly what axion means there.
Yeah, so let me just clarify for everyone that the axion is a hypothetical particle that both solves an open, outstanding problem in the standard model of particle physics, and also is potentially a good dark matter candidate. So that's what the axion is. When we talk about naming, actually, there's an interesting history behind the axion and why it's called the axion. It was almost the Higlet. I feel like that was like a big missed opportunity as a Winnie the Pooh fan.
Yeah.
The thing that comes to mind when I think about this question is a comment that the jazz musician and Vijay Iyer made to me at one point. Very casually, we were talking about improvisation one day, and Vijay, I was talking about like how people learn to improvise, and I had this boyfriend at one point who was white, who couldn't we both played alto saxophone, and he just like couldn't improvise, or I guess he played tenor for the most part, but he just like couldn't improvise to like save his life. And I was talking to him about this, and I was like how does that happen, like kind of culturally? And Vijay said, like, look, children have to be taught not to improvise. And so I do think that there is an element that actually we are being taught in our communities to have a particular relationship with improvisation. And so, often people are always like, in the Black community, we talk about like, how come like most of us like know how to dance, and like we're comfortable knowing how to dance. And then we're always talking about like, other people who are like clapping on the 1 and 3, like what's up with them? And it's really about like how you are socialized into a culture that says your thoughts, your movements, your relationship to rhythm, the way that you relate to time is meaningful in this particular way, or you're socialized into a kind of rigidity. These are the rules, follow the rules. That's the end of the conversation. The rule is there are 2 genders. You have to stick with the one that you were socially assigned at birth, right? As opposed to you're not allowed to respond to the improvisation that arises in you and says, actually, I'm non-binary. This is the way in which I'm non-binary. Or as I say in my book, I'm an agender woman. This is the way I am agender, right? So I think that this is not just about like science, but of course also it does come back to science, because I do find that students from marginalized backgrounds are more afraid to ask questions in the classroom. And part of that is that they know the consequences for saying something that other students think was not a good question, that they will probably be made fun of more, that they are already asking, do I belong in this room? And that sends the message like, really, you truly do not belong in this room, right? So, and I think that, I'll just say there are simple things that we can do to combat that, which is that in my classrooms, I make it very clear in day 1 in the syllabus and also out loud that in this classroom, people are not welcome to laugh at other people's questions. Like, that's unacceptable. You will be asked to leave my classroom if that is the environment you're creating for your classmates, right? So that is one way in which I set up the environment for ask questions creatively. Get stuck, be stuck, announce that you are stuck, please, because I can't help you if you don't tell me you need help.
Yeah, and I think that is something that is really kind of amazing about the book. I have a vexed history with physics, which is, no shade of my secondary school teacher, Mr. Andronoff, who was lovely, but I actually felt reading your book that and this is also, as somebody, a beneficiary of all of the privileges and powers of whiteness as well, is that I could suddenly ask questions, and I'm very fortunate to be actually able to ask you questions about the book that I wouldn't have considered otherwise. And I think you do, without wishing to get too much into kind of like a love-in about the book, but it is great. It is,
I'm all for that.
Okay. But it is fantastic the way that you actually make it possible to wonder about physics and what's happening in a very real sense out there above our heads and everywhere. So I think as a curative to some of the constraints of whatever pedagogy, I think this kind of book and this kind of creative approach to science communication is really important. Okay, so I'm going to get on to, we've got some more questions. I do actually have another question about Star Trek, but oh no, there's a question about there's actually a question about Star Trek. Fantastic, Nicola Sugden. Your thoughts on Star Trek as imagining an endpoint without telling us how to get there resonated with some thoughts I recently had while listening to a talk by Ruha Benjamin, where she mentioned problematic tendencies towards outsourcing decision-making to technological systems, so a doomed method for combating racism. Is there a facet of white empiricism that is a failure of imagination, and another that is, even when a socialist equitable endpoint has been imagined, a certain laziness and unwillingness to do the difficult work of fostering actively anti-racist practices and knowledges?
You know, I think, well, I have to think about this in real time. I was trying to decide whether to say that, like, calling, you know, white supremacists, even casual white supremacists, lazy was generous. I'm not sure whether I think it's generous or not. I'm, on some level, like, I'm not particularly concerned with what are the individual motivations of the people involved. Like, maybe it really is like, you know, someone's like, well, I saw the racism, but I felt uncomfortable saying anything about it. It would be inconvenient for me, so I just didn't say anything, right? There's that. But ultimately, there are these enormous economic incentives and structural incentives for the system to continue plowing forward the way that it is. And I think that's really what we are dealing with. You know, it's easy to point to Ira Stephen Bear. I'll just like go back to the example with Garrick and DS9 and not fighting with Paramount to make him a gay character. And say that, like, it's easy to be like, oh, well, Ira, you really blew it. And I actually do feel that way about it. I know Ira feels that way about it because I've seen him talking in a documentary about like how he screwed that up. But then there's also like the structural incentives that we have to look at, the structural homophobia that was like, your life will just be easier if you go along with straightness. That there weren't people in place to say, in positions of power to say, where are the gay characters in your show? Right. And you know, that the incentive is for people to go along, to get along. And I think in particular, like, just to return to Discovery and to the particularly important role that Wilson Cruz has played as an actor in the show. And by that, I mean both as someone who was on the cast and as someone who was playing a character in the show as the Doctor. That one of the reasons that Wilson has had the particular career that he has had is because he refused to be in the closet as an actor, and that meant he was cast in a particular way. And so there's a generation of people, like I'm turning 39 this year, that I grew up with my so-called life, even though there was only a season of it, with Wilson Cruz as like the first like out brown character that I ever saw on television. I'm in this like really groundbreaking role that was also cut off early because various reasons, probably partly because the show was a little bit gay, right? To see what the role he plays in season 3 of Discovery, where he is forming this queer family and literally is well, I don't want to give too much away, but at the end of the season is talking about, you will be seen, that I will make sure that you are seen, that he plays the role of saying on behalf of the writers and the cast, this season is a love note to Black love and to queer people and to queer love and queer family. This is our announcement, right? That is when the structure is different and there is a structural decision that we will tell the story together. And it's not just because Wilson's in the room, but because the entire production has made the decision. We are writing a love note to these communities that are too often not loved on especially trans people of color.